Still we try. But it is number one. Where is it?
Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to have all of you here, and we are so excited to have this inaugural lecture for the Texas Tech University Humanities Center, and to have it started by such a distinguished guest as the director of the National Humanities Center. We're so pleased to have Geoffrey Harpham here, and look forward to his comments and his perspectives, but I really appreciate you all being here. This is a historic moment, I think, in Texas Tech University history to have this inaugural Humanities Center lecture, but also in some ways to celebrate the start of the Humanities Center. We're proud, I'm proud as president to be one of the supporters of this initiative, and proud to celebrate the humanities at this institution. You know, to me, the humanities are one of the important elements, one of the important foundation elements of any great university. And one of the things that we want to build here is a great university. And we're working on that. We have many elements of that already, but certainly having strong support in the humanities is an important part of that, and we celebrate that every day with the strength that we already have here, but we want to take it clearly to another level of success. And we're joined here by other supporters of the Humanities Center, our provost and senior vice president Lawrence Skubanek, Dr. Skubanek, and also our senior vice president for research, Robert Duncan. You know, we jokingly refer to him, now that we have two Robert Duncans, we have to distinguish, and so he gets often referred to as R2D2, because just as a way, he gets a lot of the email from the chancellor and kind of helps work through that with the chancellor, so appreciate that. But you can see the influence of the humanities disciplines throughout history, and from the earliest universities, but throughout the beginning of time. The formation of countries, the governments, the education of our leaders and children, all permeated through by the humanities. And exploring and researching the important areas found within the humanities is really essential, I think, to the foundation of this university, this region, our state, and our country. And I applaud the efforts of those who work to make this possible. And many in the room have been an important part of that. But a key person in really leading that effort is the inaugural director of the Humanities Center, who I'd like to introduce at this stage, Dorothy Chansky. And so, Professor Chansky, thank you for all that you've done. Thank you all for being here as we celebrate this historic occasion with this inaugural lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, President Nellis, and thank you all for being here. We have a Humanities Center on this campus because of the farsightedness of President Nellis and Provost Lawrence Skubanek, and we have today's event because of the generosity of Vice President for Research, Rob Duncan. Thank you. Early on, I said that our center aims to be Janus-faced, that is, facing outward and facing inward. We look outward to find new, galvanizing, and significant humanities research and work, and we seek within our own campus to support scholars producing new, galvanizing, and significant work. You can read a little bit more about the Humanities Center in the program, and included in the program is a list of all the people who served on the steering committee and the people who are currently members of the board. And I just want to do a shout out to both the steering committee and the board. There's a lot of overlap there, because this is a working board and they're working. So I now want to introduce today's speaker, which I'm going to do briefly. I tend to read all programs the way I read theater programs, which is to say that the details don't make all that much sense to me until after I've seen the performance, and then I want to know everything I can know. And I have no reason to think that Geoffrey Harpham's performance is going to be anything other than star quality. So rather than introducing him via his CV, I just want to read the titles of some of his books, because they speak to the kind of deeply curious, wise, synoptic, thinking person that he is. Like Garrison Keillor and like me, he started out as an English major and, went on from there. Although rumors that he's going to have his own Saturday night radio show may or may not be true. So his titles include On the Grotesque, Strategies of Contradiction in Art and Literature, The Aesthetic Imperative in Culture and Criticism, Getting It Right, Language, Literature, and Ethics, One of Us, The Mastery of Joseph Conrad, Shadows of Ethics, Criticism and the Just Society, Language Alone, The Critical Fetish of Modernity, A Glossary of Literary Terms co-authored with Meyer H. Abrams, The Character of Criticism, On Being Human, a special issue of Daedalus, and his most recent book, which a number of us on the board have read, and which is the book that convinced me that he was the man to give our inaugural talk, The Humanities and the Dream of America. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Geoffrey Harpham.
Take it away.
Well, I want not only to thank Dorothy for her kind invitation, but also to congratulate her on a magnificent event for her and for the entire Texas Tech campus. I've never been to Lubbock before, but I have a couple of friends on the faculty. Anna Cristina Ribiera. Has Jonathan Dorsey accompanied you, Anna? There? Where's Jonathan? There you are, right. And Chris Whitmore, who was a fellow at my center this year, as Anna was a fellow last year. It's beautiful weather that you have here. I grew up in Chicago, which I had thought flat before I came here, but which now looks in retrospect something like the Swiss Alps. I'm especially pleased and grateful to have been asked to address this occasion because the cause of the joint purposiveness of the humanities and the sciences is one that I've become very, very close to. I run a National Humanities Center, so it would seem that all my attention and interest is focused on the humanities, and that's true. But one effect of that has been to awaken me to the possibilities for interconnection with other disciplines. Law, public policy, cognitive science, evolutionary biology, even computer science, primatology. I've invited all people representing all those disciplines to come and talk at the National Humanities Center, and the result has been a general enrichment of the total environment. And I really believe that a world-class campus demands and deserves a robust presence in the humanities, no matter how technological or no matter how non-humanistic the basic mission of the university might appear to be. I think that everybody is improved and everybody is enriched. And that's the argument that I'm going to be making today. Let's see, there we go. Perhaps because Steve Jobs died at a moment when the subject of jobs was very gloomily on the American mind. He died in 2011 and the unemployment rate was approaching 10% at that point. His death was the occasion of a lot of weighty rumination, with each deep thinker stepping forward to claim him on behalf of their favorite theory or preoccupation. And so Mr. Jobs was depicted as a perfect example of American technical know-how, individualism, valor and courage in the face of adversity, managerial brilliance, the psychological consequences of abandonment, high-performing autism. I'm not making this up. This is poor parenting and genius as such. And this last theory was developed by Walter Isaacson, whose biography of Jobs appeared with uncanny timing just a few days after his subject's demise. In an article in the New York Times, Isaacson argued that Jobs was not a genius of the intellect, but a genius of ingenuity, the capacity to combine technical skill with aesthetic sensibility. And here, Isaacson concluded, was the takeaway from Jobs' life. China and India are likely to produce many rigorous analytical thinkers and knowledgeable technologists. But smart, educated people don't always spawn innovation. America's advantage, if it continues to have one, will be that it can produce people who are also creative and imaginative, those who know how to stand at the intersection of science and the humanities. Now, I thought this was kind of a curious inference to draw from the life of somebody who was so unimpressed by a liberal education that he dropped out of Reed after one semester. In fact, I think it might be Isaacson himself who is more representative of American thinking than his idiosyncratic subject, because Isaacson clearly wants to believe that the secret of social success is education, an education of a particular non-specialist kind, in which the sciences are married or remarried to the humanities. Many in the United States feel that academic disciplines themselves run counter to the native genius of the people, which is pragmatic, improvisational, and inclusive rather than orderly, programmed, and constrained. This is a characteristically American position. While others are often concerned to articulate and understand the differences between the two cultures, as C.P. Snow put it, represented by science and the humanities, Americans are much more likely to denounce the very existence of distinct disciplinary cultures as unnecessary, counterproductive, and impediment to genuine thinking and research. The anti-disciplinary argument, I'm going to argue, takes two forms. The first, commonly referred to as the unity of knowledge, or consilience, is associated with the Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson, who believes that the only project, here we go, worth pursuing is the quest for the fundamental laws of nature, and that progress in this quest will only be made if science, and biology in particular, is given leadership responsibilities with other disciplines making helpful contributions on an as-needed basis. In some of the more ecstatic formulations of consilience, it's argued that it's not just sound policy, but a way of reclaiming a long-lost primordial unity of knowledge. Notice that Wilson is a very peaceable-looking man. He was one of the people that I invited to the center not long after I arrived, and I was having dinner with him afterwards. And I said, you know, many people regard you as kind of the kind and loving face of biological reductionism, which would destroy religion and everything. And he said, I have answered the altar call and gone under the waters. There was no problem at all for him. Another kind of challenge to disciplinarity is mounted in the name of interdisciplinarity, not the unity of knowledge, but the collection of different kinds of knowledge. For many years, perhaps since the invention of disciplines themselves, it's been widely accepted that complex problems such as land use or global warming, the epidemiology of AIDS, or the causes of the French Revolution are best addressed by gathering and blending and combining a number of different approaches rather than confining oneself arbitrarily to a single approach. In the American Academy in particular, interdisciplinarity too has a kind of prelapsarian aspect. It's widely seen as a way to slough off the aging bark of institutional senescence and regain epistemological innocence by occupying the fluid, dynamic, liminal spaces between established disciplines. And here's a curious thing. Calls for the unification of knowledge primarily come from scientists. But the chorus of advocates for interdisciplinarity is made up primarily of administrators, who often tout it as the best response to contemporary conditions. Thus, University President, University of Michigan President, Emeritus James Duderstadt writes, in our increasingly complex, interdependent world, narrow answers will not succeed. The interdisciplinary moment is not a fad, but a fundamental and long-term restructuring of the nature of scholarly activity. The guiding principle of a new and vibrant intellectual community, human connections between the isolated bulwarks of different departments. Bulwarks, a term to be added to other administrative synonyms for disciplines, including tombs, caves, and silos. Makes you wonder if they give you a thesaurus when you become an administrator. Now, nobody wants to be trapped in one of these airless spaces, but it's clear that with its programs and joint appointments, interdisciplinarity is not just a way of dealing with complexity, but it's also a way for deans and provosts to wrest control away from large, powerful, self-interested departments. Now let's see, I was told that I could, there we go. Now my argument in what follows is going to run counter to both of these calls for anything but disciplines. I think that disciplines should be preserved and valued, not despite their limitations, but because of them. If disciplines were to be abolished or blended or otherwise weakened, I'm going to argue that we would all be poorer. Indeed, everything would be terribly confused and there would be irreplaceable losses. I'm not suggesting that the lines between disciplines should be fiercely policed to defend against encroachments or contaminations. I'm arguing that the very existence of disciplinary boundaries has not only secured the autonomy of disciplines, enabling extraordinary advances and preserving research from external agendas, but in the matter of fences generally, has actually provoked the very efforts to cross over them, efforts that have produced some of the most exciting and productive episodes in intellectual history. As well, one has to admit, some of the most trivial and self-important. Science and the humanities are like two very large and diverse countries separated by a wide river, something that perhaps Texans can understand. Crossing that river can be profitable and interesting, but only if the crossings are occasional and considered to be risky. Too frequent or too easy crossings can produce in the constant tourist a slackened sense of general unbelonging and unimportance. Advocates for consilience or interdisciplinarity often presumes that the disciplines can be abolished or blended easily because the only obstacles to doing this are ideological or political. Advocates for preserving the disciplines make their own kind of mistake symmetrical by imagining that disciplines have an intrinsic purity that cannot be corrupted. I think that the situation is in fact much more complicated, and so I'd like to take a couple of minutes to sketch out some of the complications before moving on to actual cases. Stephen Jay Gould once described science and the humanities as two distinct ways of knowing the world, two non-overlapping magisteria, as he put it. One of them empirical and hard, and the other subjective and soft. But there are lots of ways that these magisteria do in fact overlap. There are soft sciences, for example. We call them social sciences. And within the even softer disciplines, like mine of English, there are recurrent drives, mostly theory-based, to recast the humanities as sciences humaines with a quantitative or empirical dimension. And on the other side, within the hard sciences, we find numerous concessions to, for example, the explanatory power of metaphor, or to the aesthetic qualities of elegance, beauty, or simplicity in testing the adequacy of an hypothesis. So in fact, there are widely acknowledged and well-established principles of cross-fertilization, of overlappingness. Still, it's useful to begin with a basic distinction between disciplines that, like natural sciences assisted by mathematics, seek to produce reliable knowledge about things that actually exist, and those disciplines that focus on what things mean or how they should be valued. For the purpose of this argument, I'm going to set aside the social sciences, which can go both ways. This basic, rough, even reductive distinction between goals is also a distinction between the kinds of objects that are studied. Natural science is not typically interested in man-made things, but only in things that appear in the world without human agency. Life forms, atoms, molecules, genes, photons, the little strings that make up the universe, organisms, crystals, planets, viruses. Science begins and ends in the present tense. Even when it tries to understand the origin or evolution of an organism or a species, it begins with the actually existing object and, as it were, reverse engineers it in order to understand how this object came to be. And science is staked on the premise that the world is knowable, that truth can be separated from falsehood, and that knowledge is not to be confused with opinion or belief. Also, science is almost entirely concerned with creating new knowledge. There's absolutely no point from a scientific perspective to revisiting arguments or issues settled long ago and taking a renewed satisfaction in their brilliance. The objects of science may exist in the present tense, but the focus of the field is entirely on progress towards the future, on the increase of knowledge. We try to understand how things came to be so we may predict or direct future developments. Now, for the past half century or more, the focus has been on instrumental or directed research oriented towards specific results, rather than on the basic research that once, not all that long ago, made of science a field of creativity and intellectual joy. In the era of C.P. Snow, who I mentioned earlier, who wrote of the two cultures in the late 1950s, many scientists still took an unembarrassed pride in the inutility of their vocation. But with the emergence over the course of the 1950s of the National Institutes for Health and the National Science Foundation, science in the United States became dependent on government funding, which went overwhelmingly to two primary areas, health and defense. Since the end of the Cold War, funding for defense-related activities has suffered, while a greater share of the shrinking pool of resources has gone to innovation and economic competitiveness, with a particular focus on the development of new technologies, products, processes, and services. Today, the sciences as practiced in the American research institutions are almost entirely instrumental and require no other justification than that they contribute to improved or increased productivity, jobs, health, and especially wealth. Science would seem to be an empirical undertaking based on observation of fact, as opposed to the humanistic emphasis on judgment, evaluation, and interpretation. But this is actually, I think, not the case. Empiricism does not represent a bright line between the disciplines, but a bridge. The commitment by science to empiricism is far from total, for the very first gesture that science makes when confronted by the evidence of the senses is to translate that evidence into abstractions such as numbers, symbols, graphs, or formulae, in order to get at a deeper structure of reality than the senses could possibly give us. The vocabulary of science is ideal and symbolic, and what it tries to produce is not strictly speaking empirical knowledge, but rather a formal representation of non-contingent facts, mind-independent facts. In fact, science is impatient with empiricism, which is painfully slow compared to the boost of acceleration provided by a good theory. This is the argument of James Conant, president of Harvard long ago. The presumably soft humanities actually display a quite substantial but still qualified commitment to empiricism. The humanities are concerned with man-made objects, taking a special interest in those that have some expressive value, such as documents or works of art. They study these things over and over and over again. One report published in 2009 announced that there had been 16,672 books published on Shakespeare in the preceding 50 years, a number that was way out of date by the time the study was published. The reason for this is not only that scholars have to publish, but that man-made objects require and repay such attention. They serve as mirrors for ourselves as we read our own concerns and questions into them. And they're complicated. Any man-made artifact both expresses and screens the human agency that produced it. And this agency is, to a humanist, the real object of inquiry. Science studies the thing in itself. The humanities focus on the human processes that led to the appearance or the creation of the thing. So the empirical attention to the material object, no matter how obsessively pursued, is merely a phase in an inquiry of an entirely different kind, devoted to recovering the processes that resulted in that object. It's a process of mind attempting to grasp mind through the medium of the thing. Now, the end result of humanistic scholarship is not, unlike science, reliable knowledge. Indeed, from a certain perspective, humanistic knowledge barely deserves the name of knowledge because it consists not in facts about actually existing things, but in speculation about the inaccessible processes, psychological, social, material, economic, ideological, institutional, historical, all those processes that produce them, or in assessments of their meaning or their value. The humanities give us truths that, the humanities give us not truths that we can trust, but suggestions that we can entertain, a fresh perspective, a new evaluation, a different understanding, an enriched appreciation. In a sense, the humanities give us knowledge we cannot trust and actually invite us not to trust it. Perhaps the deepest difference from an institutional perspective is that science is oriented toward professional practice, while the true locus of the humanities is in the classroom and even in society as a whole. The humanities do have a formidable research assignment. They have total responsibility for everything that anybody knows about anything beyond what happens, say, to them from last night to the present moment. But we look to the humanities for something other than factual information as well. We look for a kind of inner illumination, a sensation of expanded awareness or understanding. The humanities cannot produce the kind of knowledge that the sciences can, nor do they aspire to the predictive power that the social sciences sometimes claim. But they serve another function that's equally as valuable as these. By insisting on the importance and the value and the necessity of subjective acts, such as evaluation, judgment, and above all interpretation, they represent the liberation of the mind from its subservience to fact. No matter how closely humanists are attending to the document or the artifact they're studying, what they're really trying to do is make an argument. They're trying, in other words, to withdraw the sword of thought from the stone of necessity. If science is where the mind locks onto fact, the humanities are where the world as currently understood is opened up, subjected to speculation, inference, guesswork. They are where the mind is both disciplined to the task of precision and invited to luxuriate in possibility. Now, of course, both the scientific and the humanistic ways of knowing the world, or magisteria, are necessary. Without the scientific perspective, we'd be lost in a world of speculation, drifting ever farther from anchorage, living in a world of timelessness and subjectivity. And without the humanities, we'd be equally lost in a world of quantifiable but meaningless entities, a world of fact with no values, no significance attached, no way of judging the importance of what we are seeing. Thank God there are no wholly scientific or humanistic brains. Although some may come close, the extremes are more likely to be considered under the category of pathology or deformation than exceptional purity. And so to repeat, my argument does not concern the necessity of preserving the distinctness of these categories, but rather of preserving enough separation so that the experience of crossing the Rio Grande that divides them will be considered risky and rare and adventuresome. Routine is the enemy of genuine creativity, and any really interesting innovation benefits from having to overcome disincentives, obstacles, and the disapprobation of the majority. Okay. I'd like now to talk about three of the riskier, non-routine, and productive experiments in discipline blending in the humanities and sciences. Two of them involve humanists appropriating scientific methods. One involves science taking on humanistic issues. The first one is Darwinian literary study, a field that has made immense strides over the past 20 years, both because of new computational methods that enable us, for example, to determine things like when human beings first started to wear clothing by studying the mitochondrial DNA of body lice. Head lice are an older species than body lice. Body lice depend on fabric to live, and so by taking the DNA of body lice and kind of working back into how many mutations it would take to get the DNA of head lice, you produce the discovery that it was 80,000 years ago that human beings first started to wear clothing. Very ingenious kind of work. The ambitions of Darwinian literary study are immense, nothing less than a complete reorientation of the entire understanding of human creativity around the shattering insights of Darwin, and the rhetoric can sometimes be quite apocalyptic. But the main premises of the movement are quite simple, and they were stated early on by Joseph Carroll of Washington University, who remains one of the very leading figures in the field. Carroll argues that from an evolutionary perspective, human beings are only a late and special instance of primate evolution. Primates are late and special instances of mammalian evolution, and mammals themselves are relatively recent arrivals on the tree of animal life. Let's see if I can. There we go. There's Mr. Carroll. The peculiar cognitive, linguistic, and cultural developments of human beings have done nothing to liberate them from the elemental constraints of all animal life, the necessity of nourishment, of water and air, a certain range of temperature, protection from physical harm, and successful reproduction. The evolution of all specifically adaptive structures has proceeded within biological conditions that are larger, broader, deeper, and older than any specifically human characteristics. Now, this movement still considers itself quite young, but it's already had a couple of distinct phases. In the first phase, literary works were subjected to Darwinian readings, so the traditional plots like Boy Meets Girl or Vassal Overthrows King or Team Overcomes Long Odds and Wins the Championship were redescribed in terms of mate selection, fitness tests, and competition. Jane Austen, whose depictions of life in country villages might seem to have little to do with the Darwinian struggle, has proven to be remarkably open to Darwinian readings, since her books tend to focus on men competing for women on the basis of money and rank, and women competing for men by deploying youth and beauty. But 19th century novels in general provide an amazingly rich field for this kind of analysis. The title of one book indicates the general orientation. This phase was lots of fun, but a more sophisticated, if equally controversial approach quickly succeeded it, in which the subject was the adaptive utility of the creation and reception of art. This approach begins with the premise that we use stories to make sense of our experience and each other, constructing narratives that help us shape our lives in coherent patterns. Other emphases include the creation of art as sexual display, as a stimulant to the mind, as an introduction to the concept of play, or as a way of exercising the capacity to understand other minds. This is a major strand of this species of work today. Even if evolutionary psychology has little of interest to say about Alexander Pope or Marcel Proust, the creation and response to art is such a profoundly important species behavior that, according to the literary Darwinists, no account of human being would be complete without it. And while some have criticized the movement as amateur work, The general argument proposed by the Darwinians has provided a powerful stimulant to the discipline of literary studies, and more could be said about that, but I won't go into greater depth here. My second instance of interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary work is the one initiated by science. It's led by Geoffrey West, a high-energy particle physicist who spent some years at Los Alamos before joining the Santa Fe Institute as its director. Geoffrey, who you see here, is the son of a dressmaker and a professional gambler. His son is an assistant professor, I think, at UC San Diego, and a silver medal Olympic rower for Britain. Interesting family. West's group has been asking whether there might be universal laws of society that are analogous to those of biology and physics. He's focused his attention on the laws of scaling that he finds in biological organisms. Laws that decree that mice, if they are fortunate, live for 3 years, dogs 18, and humans about 100. Why, he asks, should size matter in longevity? He approaches this question by noting first that things scale in a surprisingly simple and comprehensive way. In organisms, measures such as metabolic rate, lifespan, growth rate, heart rate, length of aorta, a whole range of things that do not seem to be related at all, maintain a consistent proportion regardless of the size of the organism. Thus, he says in a dazzling sentence, a whale is a blown-up elephant, which is a scaled-up gorilla, which is a scaled-up human, which is a scaled-up rat, despite their obvious superficial differences. West speculates that these scaling laws are a manifestation of universal geometric fractal-like branching networks that have evolved by means of natural selection for solving problems of energy distribution, resources, and information. Because of these laws, universal scaling laws, we humans top out at about 7.5 feet, not 10. We sleep 8 hours a day and not 2, and manifest a host of other invariant behaviors and characteristics. This sounds like a case for intelligent design, but not to West, because then in a breathtaking turn, he applies the same principles to cities, very few of which could claim to be intelligently designed. And here again, with respect to, listen closely, growth rates, patent production, crime rates, wages, wealth, number of educational institutions, personal income, electric cable length, productivity per capita, number of hospitals and laundromats, pollution, disease, innovation, and speed of walking, things that have no simple analog in biology at all. As he puts it, New York is a scaled-up Detroit, which is a scaled-up Boise, which is a scaled-up Santa Fe, and so on. Virtually all cities are, in an astonishing number of respects, scaled versions of some average idealized city. And this despite the vagaries of history, natural calamities, environmental advantages and disadvantages, in spite of everything. The stunning conclusion is that the generic properties of cities are derivable from underlying principles common to all urban systems, among which is the principle that in contrast to biology, where the bigger you get, the slower you are, the pace of social life increases with size and therefore with time according to certain rates that you can describe mathematically. This principle enables us to determine with considerable quantitative accuracy the consequences of growth not only for such things as water supply, electrical grid, traffic flow, and social services, but also for a very large array of human activities that collectively drive social change, determine political structures, generate cultural activities, and in some affect in profound ways the entire detailed fabric of human interactions. As with Darwinian literary study, this remarkable project, which itself scales from cells on up to corporations and cities, surely owes much of its considerable appeal to academics and non-academics alike to its transgressive aspect. This also surely accounts for the enthusiasm with which it is embraced by the Santa Fe Institute, which sees itself as a very transgressive institute. My first two examples represent efforts, one originating in the humanities, Darwinian literary studies, and the other originating in science, to reconstitute traditional subjects of the humanities as subjects of science, with the result that soft analyses emphasizing shifting, ambiguous, contingent factors dependent on human agency are replaced by harder analyses emphasizing laws, rules, and regularities. So my last example concerns an apparently more benign merging of the quantitative methods of science, in this case geography, with the interpretive methods associated with the humanities. I'm talking about the spatial humanities, sometimes called the geohumanities, where the emphasis is not on the traditional humanistic focus, the temporal succession of events, but rather on the plotting of a number of simultaneous events occurring in a single space. Building on what's sometimes called the spatial turn in history, this new practice emerged with the development of geographic information systems, or GIS. There's Edward Ayres, was dean at the University of Virginia, then became president of the University of Richmond, and has just stepped down from that job, and is now a professor once again. In one early instance of this new practice, Ed Ayres, a pioneer in the digital humanities, it started long ago, learned code. You don't have to do that anymore to be in the digital humanities. He created a series of maps that track the changes in two communities following the emancipation of the slaves after the Civil War. He and his colleagues, and this work is always collaborative, always, started with a dated map of a given region, then placed on this map markers for race, wealth, literacy, water courses, slaveholding, roads and railways, soil type, voting patterns, and social structure. The images that resulted yielded a visualization of complex relations so that the reader could see, for example, what distribution of wealth corresponded with what voting patterns. More recent projects have achieved dramatic analytical advances by using not just GIS, but multimedia GIS, animated maps, deep mapping as it's called, and something called the geospatial semantic web. All this technology, while not developed for the humanities, gives the humanistic scholar new ways of integrating and representing information, a precise account of what Robert E. Lee would have seen on the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, the viral spread of witch trials around Salem, or the correlation between anti-monarchical sentiments and printing presses in the 18th century. The spatial humanities represent an ingenious attempt to merge a scientific discipline with the humanities in order to produce a hybrid that, at the very least, facilitates understanding and enables scholars to categorize and conceptualize information in a new way. But despite what might appear to be the triumph of amiable interdisciplinarity and the merging of geography and history, there are a couple of friction points that I'd like to note. The humanities cultivate, or even cherish, even fetishize, their ambiguities. They resist the very idea of data, for the stuff they work on is already thoroughly humanized and ambiguated. In the humanistic view, it's interpretation and construction all the way down. GIS is not well equipped to represent what might be called ambiguous metadata. It presumes the integrity of its input and does not aspire to represent the kind of qualities in which humanistic understanding specializes. As the editor of one recent collection of essays on the spatial humanities puts it with, I'll call a humanistic eloquence, GIS is spatially deterministic and requires landscapes and societal patterns and processes to be tied to the spatial geometric primitives of point, line, polygon, and pixel. GIS is, for example, untroubled by a fact that would strike a humanist as a triumphant science-boggling discovery, that the top layers, as it's called, of human activity are constantly altering the bottom layers of topography by constructing waterways, cutting down trees, and building cities, so that in a real sense there are no layers at all. GIS just doesn't care. It's at this point unclear whether the spatial humanities will produce work that's both scientifically sound and conceptually rich. What is clear, however, is that the spatial humanities represent, I think, a timely and ingenious attempt to merge a scientific discipline with a humanistic one to produce a hybrid that, at the very least, expands the range of questions that scholars can ask. So, these three examples suggest something of the variety and vitality of the cross-disciplinary movements involving the humanities and sciences today, and there are many more. They're all exciting, especially to the people involved who feel like they're in the vanguard. They've invigorated scholarship, they've created interest in the world beyond the academy, but they share one feature that humanists ought to find rather disturbing. None of these projects has any interest in human subjectivity. The species-wide drives that interest Darwinians are never conscious to the individuals whose dictates they follow. The argument for scaling as the key factor in the understanding of cities is explicitly deterministic. Tokyo is a scaled-up Lubbock, which is a scaled-up Chapel Hill, regardless of anyone in those places thinks or wishes. And the spatial turn in historical explanation has no place for the individual human mind, except as these produce quantifiable effects on the environment. To the geohumanist, a churchgoer is a churchgoer in the same sense that a church is a church. There are differences, but they don't count. On the evidence of these examples, then, the new forms of collaboration between the humanities and the sciences do not involve mutual compromise in the name of a common project. In all three cases, the sciences might seem to be dancing to the humanistic tune, but they gain without loss, while the humanities, in their eagerness, sacrifice their most fundamental subject. Both consilience and interdisciplinarity often leave the essential character of science untouched, while compromising the humanities by relegating to the peripheries of interest the focus on human subjectivity and the singular object. In short, the downside risks of collaboration seem to be greater for the humanities than for the sciences. It's in light of the risk to the humanities posed by these attractive and dynamic projects that I would insist on the differences between the ways of knowing represented by the sciences and the humanities. Science has given us the capacity to cure diseases, provide clean water, feed the world's population, deliver health care, provide energy, blow things up, and reduce our exposure to natural disasters. But science cannot help us decide what we ought to hope for, how we should rank our needs, how we should allocate scarce resources. Such decisions can only emerge from social self-understanding, which requires some collective, imaginative grasp of history, culture, and of our place in the world. We cannot expect engineers or scientists, useful though they are, to be of much assistance in this project, but we have every right to expect that the humanities should make a crucial contribution to it. As a humanist, I believe that the humanities are valuable in and of themselves, but I was excited to read the words of Charles Vest, who was then the former president of MIT, head of the National Academy of Engineers, who told a group of humanists that the sciences themselves require complementation by a robust culture of the humanities, noting that many nations, China, India, Singapore, Finland, and others, were rapidly catching up to us in promoting scientific innovation, and even worse, doing so by copying many of the things we had long been doing. Vest said that the one thing that gave him some confidence that the United States could maintain its edge, at least for a while, was the fact that, for the most part, in these countries, universities are viewed and constructed with very narrow, highly utilitarian, technology-centered approaches. I'm convinced that one comparative advantage we in the United States retain for at least a few years is that we educate our engineers in a milieu in which science and engineering education are mixed in a great stew with the humanities, the arts, and the social sciences. I'm convinced, though some disagree, that this greatly enhances the creativity and innovativeness of our graduates. The key to scientific success, according to Vest, is not to concentrate on science to the exclusion of all else, but rather to situate science in a liberal arts environment that forces students from an early age to think in different ways. If I would say the same thing actually for the humanities. American humanists lead the world in humanistic research, as they undoubtedly do in many fields. Part of the reason is that they, like the scientists, were not streamed at an early age into specialization and had to put up with those physics and biology and economics and psychology courses that destroyed their GPA, but exposed them to quantitative methods and gave them some respect for the challenges and the rigors of them. One of the most powerful arguments for maintaining the distinction between the sciences and the humanities is that the differences between them force students to maneuver between different cognitive habits, thereby making them nimble, creative, respectful of difference, and alert to opportunity. Disciplines were not created in order to establish transcendental truth. Their limitations represent concessions to human finitude. To be sure, they attract to scholarship some dullards content to play little games for low stakes, but they also attract a few iconoclastic or insubordinate types whose deepest fulfillment lies in transgression. Progress can come from both types. Disciplines create zones of freedom between the tombs or bulwarks or caves or silos where the standard rules do not apply. This is not an invariably creative space, as the advocates of interdisciplinarity sometimes argue. Often the most radical or innovative energies well up within the disciplines themselves, and some of the most tediously predictable innovations fly the flag of interdisciplinarity. But it's one possible space for innovation, and it would disappear if the disciplines collapsed. So let's not think in terms of consilience in which one discipline simply swallows all the others. Let's not imagine that the only space for intelligence is in between the disciplines. And let's not dream of a monoculture in which all disciplines simply vanish. Let's think instead of a kind of coexistence between distinct but permeable forms of inquiry and explanation in which the disciplines maintain themselves and their distinctness, but stand ready to challenge or question the others and be questioned by them in turn. This is the principle of liberal education, whose application on a mass scale qualifies as one of America's greatest inventions and testimony to the genius of its founding ideas. The genius that, when the society was committed to it, produced jobs and jobs. If we could revive this commitment and then export it to the political realm, I think we'd all be a lot better off. Thanks. Perhaps Dorothy will give me permission to answer a question or two.
Yes, we have, I would say, 10 minutes for questions. And then you are all invited to a reception in Dr. Harpham's honor that will take place in the School of Art and the Landmark Gallery, and thanks to Joe Arredondo for that. So,
okay. Sorry. Yes. Can the camera follow me? Oh, there we go. Wake up back there.
The three examples that you gave all involve kind of rigorous science being imported in various ways into the study of things human.
Yes.
Are there any interesting things going on in which those who are humanist and who have that more penetrating but more flexible approach to things are contributing to scientific knowledge and discourse? Can you find equivalent cases?
I think in general that the humanities are more responsive, receptive, and solicitous of science-humanities collaborations than scientists are. The same is not, however, true of social science, which I bracketed for the purposes of this discussion because it doesn't lend itself to the kind of reductive caricature that I was training on. I just ran for 3 years a project at my center, the National Humanities Center, on humanities and human rights, which is a discourse that has been dominated by law and public policy, to the exclusion of philosophy or cultural history as such. And the argument, the implicit argument, was that in fact these humanistic disciplines have a great deal to say. It might not advance the cause of human rights. In fact, typically the humanistic contribution was to make everything more complex or deeper in its origin or more problematic in some way. But I found that the law and public policy people were actually interested in the perspectives and the methods of historians, especially, and philosophers secondarily, because these were ways of thinking about a subject that had become completely naturalized in the social sciences, and fixed in that way. Human rights is kind of stalled. It's become a difficult subject. It's controversial. In fact, many people on my board of trustees didn't want to touch it because they thought it would be politically charged in some way or another. But if you make it into a subject of scholarship as well as kind of public policy analysis, then it becomes interesting, and it becomes really interesting. So I think that the opportunities are greater in the social sciences, including the kind of quantitative or empirical social sciences, than they are in the hard sciences and in the natural sciences, for example. Although evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology should, I think, take on the subjects of language and symbolic representation, because this is such a big part of the mechanism that has produced us. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, I'm sorry.
I understand your point about how when these border crossings become routine, then something is lost creatively.
Yeah.
You know, I would add perhaps aesthetically. But I'm wondering, administratively, one of the issues with I'm thinking specifically about collaborations between humanists and scientists, of which I participated. But administratively, they are so not routine that there aren't those kinds of routines that would allow for money to go from one place to another, and all of the kind of boring aspects of the collaboration that would in turn facilitate our thinking, allow our thinking to not be routine. So do you have any suggestions for how administratively there can be some kind of processes in place that would facilitate these kinds of exciting creative collaborations that you might be advocating?
I'm very responsive to that question because I noticed that there was a bill in Congress that would prevent the NSF from funding political science. In fact, it passed, did it not? And the NSF no longer funds anything in... It's what?
It's a yearly appropriation, so this year we do that.
Really? But a diminished amount because everything is cut.
Well, everything's got, and there's an extra layer of justification. When you mentioned national security and economic development justification on any grant.
Right. And anyhow, yes, you point to a very real problem. And I'm not sure that a solution on the level of the national policy is forthcoming. This seems to me an opportunity, however, for a campus with wise and enlightened administrators to to seize the opportunity and make the most of the resources that are right here on the campus. Often, such things grow out of fortuitous encounters between individuals. They happen in small groups that get going without a lot of support. In other words, they don't need massive funding to start. What they need is time with each other to start. And this can be facilitated. Maybe not on a huge scale, but as I said, these things often start very, very small. Then they discover their parameters as they go. I'm looking into the light, so if there's a hand I don't see, make some noise or something.
As I understand you, what you're suggesting is that it's important to have these different disciplines because you get outsider perspectives by crossing them.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that the creative force of the outsider perspective does not come from the difficulty of crossing, but from the difference between the two perspectives. So when you think, for instance, about intercultural dialogues, what makes them so fruitful is not that it's difficult. In fact, what makes them fruitful is when you ease the conversations. But what makes them fruitful is the fact that they're different cultures. So that's a challenge to your...
Pardon me, but I don't take it as a challenge. I take it as a testament to the difference between conversation and culture and an academic discipline. An academic discipline is different. It is a methodology. It's rigorous. There are procedures and precedents. There are rules. There are things that are non-disciplinary that are considered to be sloppy or non-rigorous. In a conversation, anything can happen. And the sense of a rule-bound, rule-governed activity is not as powerful as it is. But academic disciplines are very special kinds of discourse, and they develop in the way they do in order so that advances in knowledge can be measured by certain means. Advances in culture can't be measured like that. There's very little sense of progress in culture. I mean, you feel a momentary freeing or liberation or, now I understood something I didn't understand before. But advances in a scholarly discourse are they're of a different kind. And so I'd say, yes, the more intercultural cooperation and the easier it is, the better off we'll all be. But I don't feel the same way about academic cultures, which I think that the autonomy of the academic culture is maintained insofar as the distinctness of a discipline from the other disciplines is maintained.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah.
Bruce.
Well, thanks very much for this really terrific talk. And speaking intellectually, and not just as a department chair, I buy your argument about disciplines. I think it's an important argument, and I really agree with that. I wanted to pick up on your examples of those three interdisciplinary. Your overall point about the three examples that you showed us was with regard to the way that the bringing in the sciences seemed to challenge or wash out the focus on the subject, the individual or the human subject, right? And I think that's an accurate observation, but I think I'd also say it's an opportunity for the humanities to rethink the fetishization of the human. And so I've been thinking for a while about the post-humanities, one thing that means is a humanities that tries to think beyond the anthropocentric centrality of the human. I just wonder if you have any thoughts.
Well, at the risk of losing your esteem, I will push back a little on your question and say that the human is to be cherished and is to be defended. It's possible to imagine a post-human world. It's possible to imagine an approach to knowledge that simply discounts human subjectivity. But that's not a world I want to live in. It just isn't. And while I think that there is room, lots of room, for an approach to the non-human, the humans are not all there is to creation by a long shot, I think that if we lost sight of the primacy of human subjectivity for our own species, we would lose it all. And so I have a very measured respect for Kerry Wolf and the post-human movement. You know, I understand what they're doing and the difficulty of what they're doing and the conceptual boldness of what they're doing. But I don't see that as a wave that washes over humanistic studies and leaves no trace of the human.
Well, I think the human is fine. It's just, but, you know, it's, no, I want to preserve us as an important part of the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you all so much, and please. And please make your way to the School of Art. Thanks. All right. You were some kind of brilliant.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was excellent, really excellent. I'm a geographer by discipline.